By May 1945, the picture in much of Germany was not only ruined streets and abandoned tanks. In quiet factory yards and research institutes, crates sat unopened, benches were strewn with precision tooling, and under tarps lay machines unfamiliar to the soldiers who stumbled on them. Compact, gleaming turbine stages, compressor wheels, and hollow combustion chambers, parts of jet engines and prototypes that hinted at a new age of flight. Faced with those objects, Allied commanders and engineers confronted a question that would shape early Cold War aviation. What do you do with someone else's cutting-edge science? Preserve it, ship it home for study, repurpose it, or destroy it to ensure it cannot be rebuilt? The immediate problem in late spring 1945 was not theoretical. Allied units arriving in factories found delicate, often incomplete hardware that demanded different handling than armored vehicles. Jet engines were smaller than tanks, but they were fragile, often assembled with experimental alloys and precise machining, sometimes contaminated with volatile fuels, and sometimes accompanied by blueprints and test records. Some of the items were already famous in rumor. Many more were simply technical artifacts that promised lessons if someone could figure out how to read them. The race that followed was part science, part bureaucracy, and part feverish salvage, an international scramble shaped as much by shipping capacity and political directives as by scientific curiosity. If this kind of deep dive into post-war tech grabs your interest, hit like and save this for later. 3 broad approaches emerged among the victorious powers, patterns that recurred across the occupation zones and in the actions of specialized technical teams. Each reflected different national priorities and capacities, and together they explain why some engines ended up in laboratories, some in museums, some in scrapyards, and some as starting points for other nations' programs. The United States moved methodically. American technical intelligence teams prioritized careful cataloging, crating, and shipment to national testing facilities for structured evaluation. Crates were logged, serial numbers recorded where possible, and items were labeled for transport to proving grounds and aeronautical laboratories. Once in the United States, engines and components could be instrumented, mounted on test stands, and run under controlled conditions so engineers could collect data on component stresses, materials behavior, fuel consumption, and basic performance parameters. The U.S. approach treated captured hardware as an addition to a national research library, something to be dissected, compared, and, where useful, adapted into post-war design thinking. Which specific Allied aeronautical test centers handled which items is indefinito in this script and requires verification in primary sources. British teams leaned toward on-site technical appraisal. With smaller shipping capacity and an established tradition of field engineering, British specialists often performed comparative evaluations where the equipment lay, disassembling, measuring, photographing, and sometimes running limited tests without moving items far from their factories. This approach let evaluators quickly judge practical value in the context of existing British designs and manufacturing capabilities, and to recommend what should be shipped away and what could be left, demilitarized or scrapped locally. The British method reflected a pragmatic calculus. If the lessons could be extracted in situ, why expend scarce convoy space to move bulky or fragile items across the sea? The Soviet response was swift and decisive, driven by a different set of priorities. Trophy brigades and engineering units moved rapidly into captured sites, taking whole workshops, records, and machinery back to the Soviet Union. The Soviets prioritized getting materials and human capital, engineers, tooling, and plans, into their own industrial system as quickly as possible. In many cases, captured engines were shipped east, reassembled, and used for training or experimental work. Over time, however, scarcity of spare parts, different tooling standards, and competing post-war priorities meant that many captured items were cannibalized for parts or scrapped when they could not be economically supported. Where the Soviets incorporated captured ideas into their own designs or programs is a subject where specific claims should be treated cautiously. Direct lineage in many cases is indefinito and requires documentary corroboration. Across all 3 approaches, common operational steps recur: secure the site, catalog what is present, decide what to ship, and either move items to a lab or render them harmless. That procedural arc, find, record, move, test, decide, was the practical heart of the hunt for German aeronautical tech. But the reality of carrying it out was often prosaic and difficult. Engines and prototypes that looked promising on paper could be missing crucial parts, lack associated test records, or be so corroded and neglected that meaningful data collection was nearly impossible. Shipping itself presented hazards, fuel residues, fragile compressor blades, and experimental alloys that required careful packing and climate control. In many cases, the logistical burden, limited shipping capacity, damaged infrastructure, and the sheer volume of material competing for attention was a decisive factor in what survived as an object of study. Across the devastated industrial landscape, there were particular kinds of discoveries that recur in the record. Research institutes and test benches were left with incomplete or experimental airframes, proto-engines that had passed through 1 or 2 cycles on a stand, stacks of blueprints and lab notebooks, and boxes of precision parts that on first glance looked cryptic to non-specialists. Some institutes, names recorded in occupation reports as technical centers, for example, Kummersdorf, Hillersleben, Haustenbeck in other contexts, contained workshops with partially assembled components. In many of these places, Allied engineers later found test instrumentation, notes describing performance under certain fuels or pressures, and tooling that suggested machining techniques unfamiliar to Allied factories. When engineers pried open a crate and saw a compressor wheel the size of a soup plate, they knew they had found more than scrap. When they found lab books with measured runs and failure logs, they had a chance to learn, provided the books had survived and the notation could be deciphered. But learning was rarely straightforward. Running a captured turbine on a test stand required spares, seals, and the right fuels. Test instrumentation, pressure gauges, thermocouples, tachometers, had to be compatible or else remounted. Reverse engineering demanded more than drawing the contours of a blade. It required knowledge of the metallurgical treatments, manufacturing tolerances, and cooling techniques used in the original factory. Often, Allied teams discovered that even when a component looked advanced, it had been produced in tiny numbers, with special bimetallic or single-source processes that would be difficult to replicate at scale. The lesson emerges again and again. A promising design on a bench sheet is not the same as an aircraft engine you can build and sustain in volume. To bring this point closer to the human scale, picture a small reconstruction workshop in an Allied-occupied town sometime in 1946. A handful of engineers and technicians have a single German engine on a stand. They lack 1 or 2 critical seals and a method to reliably cast a particular alloy used in a turbine disc. Rather than consign the engine to a crate and a museum, they begin cannibalizing parts from other captured specimens, ordering what spares they can find, and improvising repairs. Over weeks, they keep one engine running long enough to take measurements and to demonstrate certain combustion behaviors. But when the team disbands or when the chain of spares dries up, this engine often ends its life in a scrap furnace, or it ends up as a static museum exhibit, a handsome but silent lesson in both innovation and fragility. The decision of what to do with captured jet technology was also political and legal. Occupation authorities and early post-war directives emphasized demilitarization. Denazification of the German economy included destroying certain classes of weapons and facilities so they could not contribute to future hostilities. At the same time, practical national interest argued for retaining and studying technology. Reconciling those aims produced both formal orders and ad hoc outcomes. Some items were shipped to the victors for evaluation and later returned in altered form. Many others were ordered destroyed outright. The balance struck varied by occupation zone and by the technical value perceived at the time. Specific Allied Control Council decisions and the names of directives governing demilitarization of aeronautical hardware are indefinito here and should be checked against primary archival sources for precise citation. Not every piece of hardware was treated as a prize. Scrap metal shortages in the immediate post-war period gave some engines a different destiny, simply melted down for raw material to fuel reconstruction. In other instances, captured technology became a bargaining chip or a transfer item. Some engines, components, and blueprints found their way into the arsenals or workshops of other European nations. France and Czechoslovakia used captured aeronautical assets to rebuild and to inform their early post-war programs. Spain and certain Middle Eastern states acquired materials in the complex post-war trade and diplomatic networks that redistributed military goods across the continent and beyond. Records show ad hoc purchases, formal reparations, and opportunistic transfers, paths by which German hardware influenced a wider geography than the original battlefield. These redistributions are documented in some national archives, but precise lists tying specific captured engines to particular foreign programs are often complex and, for particular claims, indefinito without direct source citation. As time passed, some of the most evocative stories migrated from occupation reports into rumor. Tales circulated of hidden vaults stuffed with wonder weapons, secret engines that had been spirited away to prevent the Allies from learning their secrets. Those stories are part of the myth-making that follows every major technological surprise, but the documentary record is usually more humdrum. Inventories, crates shipped across the Channel or the Atlantic, test stand logs, and, in some cases, destruction orders with signatures. Where rumors persist of stockpiles that vanished from record, historians seek corroboration in transport manifests, customs records, and surviving correspondence. Without that documentation, sensational vault narratives must be treated as rumor, and in many archival accounts the dominant image is not a secret bunker, but a busy logistics chain, administrative forms, and the occasional theft or private salvage. One of the most important analytical points is how captured technology actually influenced early Cold War aviation. Technical artifacts provided inspiration and concrete data. Engineers could see novel compressor geometries, combustion chamber layouts, and approaches to turbine cooling. Such observations fed into design thinking. The idea that higher mass flow through compressors or particular approaches to fuel-air mixing could yield performance gains. But translating a novel part into an operational engine suite required far more than a blueprint. Industrial capacity, supply chains for specific alloys, manufacturing standards, and a reliable logistical tail were indispensable. In plain terms, having an advanced prototype did not automatically create a strategic leap. What mattered equally was the ability to produce, maintain, and field reliable engines at scale. This is why the post-war aviation story is less about a single stolen secret and more about a mosaic of influences, conceptual lessons, metallurgy hints, and practical procedures transferred through study and encounter. In many cases, the captured artifacts pushed designers to rethink problems and to accelerate programs that were already underway. In other cases, the artifacts were dead ends, intriguing engineering curiosities that could not be translated into sustainable production. Any claim that a specific German engine design was directly reversed into a particular Allied or Soviet production model needs archival proof. Absent that, the safer summary is that the captured material informed thinking without necessarily establishing direct lineage. Specific assertions of direct technological lineage for particular engines are indefinito here and should be validated against technical program histories. The physical fates of these artifacts were varied. A number of engines and components survived into museums, where they stand today as silent witnesses to an engineering transition. Others were cannibalized to support experiments and training. Others still were dumped into the scrap stream and melted into the steel that rebuilt rail lines and bridges. The practical demands of immediate post-war recovery, food, shelter, transport, often outranked what might have seemed long-term intellectual gains. That practical calculus explains why so much promising hardware was lost. It was absorbed back into rebuilding economies or discarded once its immediate experimental value was exhausted. There is an ethical dimension to recounting this tale. Curiosity about technology must be framed within the context of the regime that produced it. Studying how the Allies managed captured German aeronautical advances is not the same as celebrating those advances. The period's technical achievements existed within a larger history of aggression and atrocity. The post-war hunt for technology reflected strategic necessities and scientific interest, but it also unfolded against a backdrop where accountability, reconstruction, and geopolitical rivalry competed for attention. If one returns to that opening image, an Allied boot on a rusted compressor wheel in a yard of tarpaulins and crates, it becomes possible to see the wider pattern. The Allies did not discover a single, decisive wonder weapon hidden in a vault, nor did they come away empty-handed. They inherited a science in fragments, hardware, notes, tooling, and people. The choices they made, what to test, what to ship, what to scrap, and what to preserve, were shaped as much by logistics, policy, and legal constraints as by the promise of any individual piece of technology. Over the next decade, the influence of those choices would appear in subtle ways across Western and Soviet aviation programs, not as direct copies but as part of a shared set of lessons about turbines, compressors, combustion, and materials. For the curious listener who wants to follow the thread further, the archive is rich. Proving ground reports, occupation directives, and engineers' diaries reveal the messy, fascinating business of turning captured metal into usable knowledge. And while specific technical lineages should always be checked against primary documents, the overall story is clear. Cutting-edge equipment found in the ruins of 1945 had potential, but potential alone did not guarantee post-war dominance. Manufacturing, supply, and institutional capacity proved decisive. If you enjoyed this look inside the immediate post-war hunt for German aeronautical technology, subscribe for more History Inside. Next up, a closer examination of what happened to German U-boats and other naval technologies after 1945.